Hello, hello, hello. Happy Pride Month. Oh my goodness. Oh, I love that everyone's already coming in. So great to see you all. Thank you for being with us today. I am delighted to be continuing our Pride Month conversations. But my guess is those of you who are watching or listening are like, Brian looks like he might be in a different place today. So I just want to just maybe answer that question. I am in a different place today. I'm in my car. And I think you can probably see Bosco sleeping back there. Bosco, who's our Chief Happiness Officer at Hummingbird Humanity. Bosco and I are in the midst of making a move and on our way down to our new home in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale. So I stopped, though. I didn't want to miss Hummingbird Hour. It's important to me and to our community, and I wanted to be able to come to join you today and come and say hello to everyone, and also kick off today's event, which I am super excited about. So today we have Julia Hamilton, who is the business manager for Hummingbird Humanity. Actually, let me go ahead and take these slides down, and I'll start over. There we go. We have Julia Hamilton, who's the business manager for Hummingbird Humanity. You can wave again now, Julia. There we go. Because I saw the wave, but I don't know if everyone else got to see it. So, and then we have Natasha Poroskova, who is a consultant with Nika White Consulting, one of the firms that we get to collaborate with at Hummingbird. And one of the ways that we've been collaborating with Nika White is there are Natasha and Mark Travis Rivera are both members of Nika White's team who are LGBTQ plus individuals. So they've been joining us for some of our events this year for Pride, which is super fantastic. And I love that partnership and collaboration and finding new ways. Oh, Mark's with us. Hi, Mark. Oh, that's right. And I have to remember, we have both of our guest hosts today are having birthdays this week. So today is Natasha's birthday and Thursday is Julia's birthday. So happy birthday to you both. I would typically sing, but I'm going to spare everyone that moment right now. And I don't want to take more time away from today's conversation. So today's conversation is titled Supporting Queer Women. And this conversation is important to me, and I think important to the community, because we still have work to, as much as we have to celebrate about the progress and the success that we've had as a community in acceptance, and in many different ways and forms. We still need to work on how do we amplify the entire spectrum of the community, and there are so many wonderful voices and messages. And so today we're going to talk about members of the community who are women, and who identify as lesbian or identify as gay women, and there's probably other representation there that Julia and Natasha may share with us in the conversation as well. So really delighted to have two women who are part of the LGBTQ plus community join us today and talk about their experiences and to share with us some things that we can do to support the L in LGBTQ plus. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julia to lead the charge and the conversation today with Natasha. I'll be in the background listening, but I'm probably going to get back on the road driving because I still got a few hours to go. And so Julia will be taking over for saying goodbye at the end of the episode today on my behalf. So Natasha and Julia, thank you so much for being here today. And over to you. Have a great conversation.
Cool. Thanks so much, Brian. And just absolutely +1, Natasha, happy birthday. So awesome to have you here and just, got to celebrate and amplify all Pride Month long. So I think, today we really just want to have a conversation like what does it mean to support queer women in the LGBTQ plus community and then more broadly, in society, and specifically thinking about like what are some ways that we can, support queer women in the workplace. I think conversations in companies have made a lot of great progress as far as talking about the LGBTQ plus community at work now, and we're seeing more of that in society. But for me, and we've talked about this, it feels like those conversations predominantly center around, gay men, cisgender gay white men, right? And that spaces for us, for queer women, for bi women, for lesbian women, just don't feel like they're as prevalent as they could be, that sort of sense of belonging and feeling like you belong to that community just kind of isn't always there. So I guess just to start, like, what are your thoughts generally, just, thinking about supporting queer women, like what can we be doing, more in that area?
Yeah, well, first I want to say thank you for having me, Julia and Brian, and the whole Hummingbird Humanity crew. I'm super thrilled to be here today on my birthday during Pride Month. I had to, of course, dress Pride ready with earrings from one of my teammates who's actually here today, Steph. So thank you, Steph. These were a birthday gift, I believe, last year. But it's a great question. And it's so true that within the LGBTQ community, we often hear, I'm an ally, I love the gays, gay people, and people say that with the best intentions. But when we say gay, we are actually excluding a whole spectrum of individuals. When we think about the LGBTQ plus community, which within itself has, some thoughts around it with the plus, but we're forgetting about the lesbians, the bisexuals, the trans individuals, the queer. We're forgetting about so many different other aspects of queer life. And so it's been part of as a part of the community and as a member, it's been part of my role and hope within the world to create greater awareness that we're often forgotten about, that we're kind of left to the side. There's really little representation as a whole. Specifically, when I talk about my own coming out story, if you stop and you think, what does a lesbian look like? Mm-hmm. I don't think I fit that traditional mold at all. When I would hear that growing up, well, one, I didn't even really know what that word meant. And so there needs to be more representation about, it's not just one sexual orientation. It's not just boys like girls, girls like boys, which is what I was so much of a rule follower growing up. So I didn't realize that you could go outside of that confinement. And it's not because my parents taught me any other way. It's just, I was like, this is the way that it is. And so I didn't have anyone like that in my life. There was one lesbian my senior year of high school I was aware of, and she was the stereotypical. She played softball. She had short hair. She was very masculine, and I couldn't identify with that in any way. That wasn't my experience as a woman. And so the first things first is we have to highlight queer women in the world. Yeah. And I think it's an interesting question to ask people. When you think of lesbian women or queer women, who are the first people that come to mind? And we had this conversation, Julia.
Yeah.
Who comes to mind? And Ellen and Portia don't count, because that's the first thing that everyone typically thinks of. Like, oh, Ellen DeGeneres, that's a lesbian I know. Or even Ruby Rose, who's now gender nonconforming. But there's such a lack of awareness on even people in the media, celebrities, musicians, people being aware of queer identities. So it all starts with representation and being out and proud. And so that was a word dump to start off. Where do we move the conversation? What do you want?
I mean, building off of that, if folks want to post in the chat, I think this is a conversation we had. If people want to share, who are the queer women you look up to, and yeah, Ellen and Portia don't count. I think particularly what you said about representation, that there's not a big awareness around the lesbian or queer women community. And then to the extent that there is, it's very sort of pinholed, right? And I remember when I was growing up, when I came out, people associated me like with Ellen DeGeneres because I'm more masculine presenting. I wear men's clothing. I have shorter hair. And so when I would tell people, that I'm gay and I'm a lesbian, people would say like, oh yeah, I totally get it. I watched the Ellen DeGeneres show, and that doesn't, make me feel that I'm seen, that I'm my own person outside of just one queer woman. But the other thing that it sort of made me feel was that, okay, well, she's, in the media, and if she's the only representation, does that mean if that's not a path I want to go, that I don't have a path for me? I think part of what queer women face, and I definitely faced this at my previous job, I worked in financial services, is that when we can't see people like ourselves in roles we want to have, there's the perception that then those roles probably aren't available for you, or that maybe these are not roles that you should be going for because nobody like you fits in those roles, right? And I think particularly that representation of lesbian as being like more masculine, more butch, it can kind of make the queer experience more isolating, and in a lot of ways, some comments I've gotten over the years of people being surprised at feminine parts of my identity, which I always think is it sort of in thinking about gender norms, how gender norms play out is crucial for women and women's advancement on the whole, but particularly in lesbian relationships as far as what should a lesbian couple look like, right? And there's a stereotype around it's sort of a more masculine presenting woman and a feminine, presenting woman. And I remember, like, I love to bake. I'm a big baker. It's like a hobby of mine. I'm not an excellent cook, but I love to bake. I like to bake lemon bars. That's like my specialty. And I remember in college, people were like, wow, that's so surprising because you're, so masculine. I remember thinking, like, so that's my whole identity, is my being a gay woman is just all of who I am. And anything that doesn't conform to the stereotypes that society has perpetuated around what gay women look like, you're sort of reduced to that identity. Do you kind of feel that way as well? Sort of feeling like who you are as a human doesn't always extend beyond what people perceive once they learn about your, sexual orientation?
So I think it's interesting you brought up the point about pigeonholing, which I think happens on both sides. So within the straight community, because I don't look a certain way, therefore that doesn't compute. And so I'm pigeonholed to look a certain way. And I think even in the last couple of years, that's grown and shifted and evolved in a great way. It's more apparent that you can be all different kinds of ways and still be a part of the queer community. But there's pigeonholing that happens even within the queer women space that, I would go to lesbian bars or gay bars and, people wouldn't believe that I was there for the purpose of trying to meet people. And, whether it was a romantic partner or it was just friendship. Brian and I were just talking about this before I joined, but back a few years ago, I was in Orlando at some of the gay bars there. I was at Pulse and I was at Southern Nights, and people were like, "No, you're not gay." Like, no, because I went in a dress. I was very dressed up. I was on vacation. I was, I like to dress up. I like to get fancy. And people were just telling me, no, like, you're clearly not meant to be here. And, that didn't feel super welcoming. And then when I'm from Dallas and I lived in Dallas for a long time, and sort of the same thing would apply when I would go out to the bars that, people are like, I don't know, I don't really believe it. And so I had to throw myself into the queer community in Dallas. And I ended up starting a collective that is now still strong and running. I don't live in Dallas anymore, but there is still a large community of women in Dallas that are running. It was called Lady, a queer women's collective. And it was almost like I had to prove my own queerness, that I had to say, like, hey, I'm here, I'm queer, I'm staying, you have to just accept it. And so even within the LGBTQ community and queer women, it can be so pigeonholing, especially when it comes to identify as bisexual. I identify as more lesbian, queer, but for, my bi friends who get so much bi hate from the straight community and the queer community because, they're not enough of either camp. And it's interesting to see how we even hate others within our community, despite needing to be a community and loving on one another and caring for one another. And I know we both just watched, if you haven't heard of the Lesbian Bar Project, that came out, was it last week, Julia? You were the one.
June 3rd, it came out, So it's an interesting, where you're talking about with queer spaces, like, we have to, progress for some of us does not equate to progress for the community, right? And if we're not all moving forward, and this extends beyond, queer women, I think about LGBT folks of color, thinking about, the trans and non-binary communities, like really creating spaces for all of us to be not just included, welcomed, and accepted into society, but just within our own community, that there isn't always that space for all of us to come together. And we were talking about this the other day, that I think there's a perception perhaps outside of the LGBTQ plus community that, it's a very like tight-knit community, that folks are sort of really, involved and kind of ingrained with each other. And the Lesbian Bar Project, and Ben, thank you, just posted it in the chat. So it's a documentary, came out last week, Leah Delaria, I believe, is the director. And you can watch it directly on the webpage. It's about 20 minutes, but essentially it's highlighting the story of lesbian bars in the US. And the statistic for me that was really striking was there are currently 21 lesbian bars in the US, and that's down from about 200 in the 1980s, which even 200 for the size of this country is small. But just thinking about that, there's such a from a social perspective, right, outside of work, it's isolating being the only queer woman at work. But then when you leave work, it's not like there's a plethora of spaces for queer women to go be in. And growing up in New York City, when I came out, I thought, I didn't realize, but I, lived not far from Hell's Kitchen, and there were so many bars for men. And so when I came out, I thought, oh, well, there must be lots of spaces for me to be in. I didn't live near them, and I could go find them. And I quickly learned that there were three. There's Ginger's in Brooklyn, the Cubby Hole in the Village, and Henrietta Hudson in the Village. And that was just sort of jarring that throughout my whole adult life living here, there are three dedicated spaces. For people like me in a city of 8 million, it's just very isolating to not feel like there's a strong presence, and I think when people think about places like New York City, like London, like San Francisco, they think that there's a very strong LGBT community, and there is, but as far as dedicated spaces, being intentional with creating space, they're very sort of dominated, by gay men. And when I think about queer neighborhoods, I don't think of spaces where there's a lot of queer women, right? So, I mean, how do you think about sort of the social scene as far as like including women? Because you're up in Boston, is it, similar there as far as like a lack of, of queer female spaces from a social perspective?
Yeah, so I have been in Boston not all of that long in the grand scheme of things. I moved here, like I said, from Dallas about 1.5 years ago now, which was an inopportune time to move. We didn't anticipate a global pandemic preventing me from being able to really explore my new home and new area. But my fiance is from, or has spent a great amount of time in the Boston area. And there are no queer women bars. There are lots of gay men bars. There are certainly many. Not far from here is P-Town, which is known as a vacation place for families, but also a very, very queer friendly, one of the gayest cities in America. But there is no queer women's space in Boston. Back when my fiance lived here, she was a door person at many different gay bars, but she told me she would get sometimes mistaken for a twink, which was a word I didn't know prior to her, actually. But in Boston, there really isn't a whole lot. And, you mentioned in New York City that there are only three bars, but that's also a luxury that there are three out of the 21 in the whole US. And I'm very fortunate that back in Dallas, that was another one of the 21 bars, Sue Ellen's, that I myself spent a lot of time, hanging out there. Every time you would go to Sue Ellen's, unless it was a Saturday night, it was usually quite dead, because it is a reality that, lesbians often, once they pair off, they stop going out, they stop doing things. They really, the joke is with lesbians, like after the second date, you U-Haul and you move in with one another, and, you are just tucked away from all life until you break up, if you ever break up, and then it's back in the vicious cycle. So that is part of the issue, certainly, that we don't necessarily always have the same interest to continue to go out that gay men do. But in the documentary, again, it's only 20 minutes long. I recommend anyone watching this live right now or anyone watching the replay that you should take 20 minutes to view it. But yeah, it's disappointing that the only places as well that we can really come together are bars, because they're wonderful. And, anytime I'm in a city with a lesbian bar, I go there. I think it's important to be a patron of queer-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, especially queer women-owned businesses, and really making sure that they can continue to be alive and thrive. But I do think it's important to have other spaces as well. One of the reasons that I started the collective Lady is that going to Sue Ellen's, the lesbian bar, and a couple other events. I was very fortunate that there were events happening in Dallas, but there was, and still is, Chick Happy Hour, which was a once a month happy hour where all of the lesbians in all of the Dallas DFW area would come together for one night and just get plastered most of the time. And then there was a pool party every summer, and same thing, everyone would come together and drink and have a good time. But I realized that there weren't any other opportunities outside of getting drunk and, you know, potentially forgetting what happened, going a little bit too hard. And I think it's wonderful to get drunk if that's something that you want to do. If you drink, there are plenty of people who don't drink, and I realized that that was an issue and there was an opportunity there to create additional spaces. And so I tried to activate spaces outside of the neighborhood. So going to straight neighborhoods, if you will, or going and having specific spaces for queer women where they could, you know, still feel that sense of community outside of the lesbian bars. We had an event every month that was, and I know they still do partnerships. I believe they still do partnerships with Sue Ellen's, but we would still make it a point to go to Sue Ellen's and make sure that we were there and like giving money to the business to keep it growing and keep it alive and well, because it was a great place to be. And every time I go home when I can, I try and visit. But it is more than just lesbian bars. It's important to have those spaces that, you know, straight people have the luxury of everywhere they go is a straight friendly place. And that's not always the case for queer women. And so having spaces that are bars and also regular spaces that we can go to that it feels comfortable.
Yeah, because I think you touched on an interesting point with the nightlife. You know, this perception, thinking about Pride, you know, companies slap on a logo, you put up the rainbow pride flag, or a lot of companies are now using the Progress Pride flag. You know, allies think about, you know, how do they demonstrate support for the community as, oh, I go to the parade, you know, and those sort of actions can come off not only performative, but just sort of that the idea of the queer experience is sort of limited to this kind of nightlife, you know, fun parade, balloons, rainbow celebration. And not that that's not important. Nightlife is, you know, important to the human experience, and celebrating our culture and our history, you know, in a fun and engaging way is certainly wonderful. But it doesn't have to be kind of the only way that we, you know, come together and sort of occupy spaces, thinking about, you know, other forms of culture and other, you know, forms of education and, you know, that kind of stuff. So I'm curious, thinking about like supporting queer women, and then I, you know, kind of want to talk about in the workplace, but the initiative you talked about in Dallas, like, did you face any sort of challenges or obstacles in thinking about, you know, how can we help like panelists today, either who are queer women who want to build more spaces for themselves, you know, or allies, like what was sort of the roadmap how did that kind of look like for you?
Yeah, so it started with myself realizing, you know, I talked to lots of other people within the community that there was a need for more, that, you know, we were loving the opportunity to meet, but it was also limited to the once a month or the once a month pool parties in the summer. And so there wasn't a whole lot else that we could really know that, oh, on this time, at this date, at this time, I know that there will be a community that looks like me. And going to these events was amazing. I remember the first Chick Happy Hour I went to, and it was just wall to wall filled with queer women, and I'd never seen a space like it before, and it was just amazing. Like, I definitely at the moment didn't feel like I belonged, because it was my first like real experience where I was around queer women and not just a bunch of gay men at a gay bar. And so that was intimidating, but it was a really beautiful and cool experience. In terms of how I went about it, you know, it never would have existed without the community. And so, you know, I reached out to a few different other people who were also really interested in really maximizing our potential of the queer community and activating spaces. And so started out with a few people thinking about what resources, what networks do we already have within the community that we can expand. So I would just reach out to people that I knew that worked in different spaces. I worked for the Performing Arts Center, so I worked to do an event specifically at the Performing Arts Center for, we had the show Fun Home come through about the life of Alison Bechtel and her coming out story. And so I worked that out with our music venue. I reached out to, there was a place called Sundown at the Granada, which was attached to a music venue, and that's where we had our launch party, and it was about activating other queer women. And so we had like an art show where people could buy people's works right there on site. And so whether it was artwork or jewelry, we had a tarot card reader, we had different events and activities. There was like a whole little like pride station where you could draw whatever you wanted. And it wasn't just about drinking. At that first event, there was a bar with one bartender. And, if people wanted to drink, they could also get food there because it was also a restaurant. And from that, we kind of, the people that were starting this initiative, we just went around and we're like, hey, I've never seen you before. It's great to meet you. What are you interested in seeing more of? Where'd you come from? Do you live around here? Who told you about this? And just kind of getting to know the community that was there. And throughout my time with Lady, I lived in Dallas for another year, and that's as long as I worked on the project. Like I said, now it's still going with the original people who started it with me. But when I would be out in public and I'd see someone that I perceived to potentially be queer or questioning, it was sometimes uncomfortable, but I was just like, hey, we had business cards. It was kind of lame, but I'd be like, hey, I don't know. And I wouldn't, because people can take offense if you think that they're queer and they're not. Yeah. I wish that wasn't the case. So usually I would like. It
shouldn't be a bad thing, right?
It shouldn't be a bad thing.
Negative thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I'd pay attention, and, especially if I saw people that looked like a couple to me, I'd go over and be like, hey, me and my friends are hanging out and I'm wondering, we have a collective. If you're interested in ever coming to our events, here's our business card. We have an event coming up, and I'd always plug the closest one. And I remember particularly there was a time I introduced myself to two women, and the next couple of days later they were at our event, which we had a series called Sweat, which was about like exercising and doing things. And it was a free boxing class with a boxing studio that had reached out to me, and we did a partnership. And they were there, and I was like, oh my gosh, you showed up. It's so wonderful to see you. And they started getting activated and engaged, and seeing photos of Lady now and the amount that it's grown just from those one-to-one connections, to be like, hey, I'm really going out on a limb here. I don't know you, you don't know me, but I just wanted to say, if you're looking for friends, community, because often queer women are in this island by themselves. Like before I thrust myself into this work and I really tried to find people, I felt alone and on an island. I only had gay men, and they're like, I'd love to help you, but I don't know where you go or what you do to find people. And so it was about that feeling uncomfortable, but saying, hey, I see you. If you want to meet people, if you don't want to, that's okay too, but trying to make those connections. And then when they would come to the events, talk to them more, be like, I'm so glad that you're here. Like, I'd love to know more about you, and creating those relationships so that the community could really be fostered and grown.
Yeah. And it sounds like building it really organically, right? Because that sort of feeling of isolation is real, and you don't have this network of there's this organization and this nonprofit and this restaurant and like all these local places to go to. You're, kind of doing it very grassroots because these establishments don't exist, and it's sort of cyclical in that these establishments, if they did exist in more sort of, foundational ways, we wouldn't perhaps need all of these initiatives, but they don't exist. And then kind of trying to create them, that sort of catch-22. But that's awesome. I mean, the work you did there, it's so cool. Do you, I'm curious, like because in a social setting in New York, I'm super lucky, three queer bars here specifically for women. So from that perspective, I mean, I'm there frequently. I'm definitely at Henrietta's more because Cubbyhole, if anyone's been, is actually like, it's very small. The name is sort of very spot on with the space, and I like to talk with my hands, and that's sort of challenging in that environment. So I'm at Henrietta's a lot, and I feel supported there. But from a workplace perspective, do you ever find this sort of challenge in people outside of the community, but particularly like outside of the queer female community, kind of how do they take steps to support you? Because I often find, like, I'll hear, particularly from men, this idea of like, oh, I totally support you as a gay person, like I'm all about supporting the LGBT community. But those same men and those same people don't sort of take steps to kind of demonstrate that proactivity, that allyship, those actions that could be really impactful, in my career as a woman. Like I feel like sometimes, it's sort of supporting me as a gay person is kind of separate from supporting me as a woman. Do you ever kind of experience that? Because I feel like it's a unique, not struggle, but it's a different set of challenges being in a professional space, being both queer and female. So I was just wondering if you've kind of experienced that as well.
Yeah, so being an ally to someone who's a queer woman, that's intersectionality at its finest, two of those underestimated groups coming together into one. If you bring race into it, that's another aspect, another layer to the intersectional cake. But for me, in my past workplaces, it was really about my best friends at work asking, what can I do? How can I show up for you? And not assuming like I need to come in and be like the knight on a shining armor and I will do whatever I need to for you and like beat up whoever I need to. Like, it wasn't about that.
Right.
It was about, tell us how we can best support you and how we can be friends and advocates and allies to you. And so it really will differ for every person. But when you do have those people in the workplace that are like, I'm here for you, like, say, great, here is what would be great for me.
Yeah.
Because you're willing to show up for me, this is what I need.
Yeah.
Telling them so that they don't have to assume, they don't have to do something that maybe would have an inadvertent effect and actually work against you. I think one great thing to recommend is, sponsorship. Sponsorship isn't necessarily about like, I sponsor Julia and Julia is the best, but it's whenever Julia's not around and I'm with her boss, with Brian or other people who are tangential to Julia, being like, Julia did a really tremendous job at X and is really excelling here, and taking those opportunities to highlight opportunities for you to grow your career. Because sometimes, especially when we're more at the bottom, I'm not saying that you are, Julia, I know Hummingbird is a small organization, but at my last organization, I was more at the bottom in the grand scheme of the hierarchy. And when you have people who care about you that are closer to the top, when they bring up your name, you become more real and more visible to those people. And so if it's saying, hey, if this person is higher up in the totem pole, which again, I'm trying not to use that word, cultural appropriation, but someone who's higher up in the organization saying, if you have the opportunities, I'd love for you to be a sponsor. And again, sponsor isn't anything about like, it's not a badge that you wear. It's really just about spreading goodness and praise. And so that's one way. For me, it was really just having somebody that I could go to. So my best friends at work, they knew that if I ever needed them, I could go to them and say, hey, like, this is what I need. This is how I'm feeling. This is what happened at work or whatever it was. But being there as a support system to do whatever the person, us being queer women, need to be successful and feel like they belong and welcomed in the workplace.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for that sponsorship, I think clarifying like intentionally how people can be helpful is super important. And for me, I mean, prior to working at Hummingbird, I was in financial services. I worked at an investment bank. I was quite junior when I left, but I worked on a pronouns initiative where I was with a colleague of mine who was a vice president at the time. I was an associate, also gay. He's a gay cisgender man. But what I found from him that was really helpful was asking questions to sort of break down certain barriers that help you move up, and seeing like how can we create more space outside of, you know, just sort of the promotion cycle. So what we worked on, you know, throughout the year, our firm had like an employee resource group for the LGBT network, and the steering committee, so the people who were involved were all vice presidents, and were all gay men with the exception of one woman who is an ally and one woman who's queer. And I'm talking in a group of maybe 30 people. So like very small representation of women, and even smaller representation of queer women. And so we were leading this initiative together, the two of us. And I remember him asking our managing director, our co-lead for the network, you know, if I could start to join the meetings to kind of present on our work. And the initial response was, you know, no, because this space is for the steering committee. And he, you know, took it upon himself, I think, sort of with my probing, to say, well, why is that? Like, is there not a way, you know, perhaps Julia doesn't need to be like added officially to the steering committee because there's a title, but can she not just be in the room to talk about the work she's doing, because we were doing it together? And I think sometimes barriers to move up, and to your point, just getting your name out there is so helpful and so important. But if not for him asking, you know, are there other ways we could, you know, promote the work Julia's doing? Can we drop an email to her manager to let her know, you know, these extra things we do outside of our day job that are meaningful and impactful? I think that can be really helpful too, is asking the questions of, you know, well, why can't we have X person in this room, right? Or why is such and such person not in the conversation, you know, and thinking about hiring, like who we bring into our organizations, and thinking about, you know, we're not saying, you know, you have to go out and hire just only queer women right now, but thinking about when you are hiring, who are we hiring? And like, can we be a little bit more intentional in seeking out, you know, kind of more representation? I think being more intentional with the questions we ask can kind of help unpack that in the workplace, because it's not always intentional that queer women are being left out. But on the flip side, it's not intentional that queer women are being brought in. So at some point, the intention of taking steps to actively bring queer women into the conversation and into the, you know, discussion rooms where change is happening has to happen on one side. So I just think that's sort of an important, you know, perhaps piece of advice I would share.
Yeah, and I'll jump in because you were talking about being intentional with the questions that we ask and talking about pronouns. It also has to do with being intentional about, you know, asking about people's personal lives in general, because both in the workplace and out of the workplace, the amount of times that I had people just kind of assume that I had a boyfriend, like, oh, do you have a boyfriend? Which is kind of a weird question to ask in the workplace in general.
Right.
But
right, that aside.
Yeah, or when they'd be at work and might be like, oh, are you bringing your boyfriend with you? And again, still sort of a strange question that might be a leading question. But instead of assuming that, this would often happen to me in Ubers, which doesn't happen as much now with COVID, and I don't really take Ubers, but people saying, oh, do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a fiance? Like, how do you not have a boyfriend? Like, you're so beautiful, you should have a boyfriend. It's like, it's not always worth my time to be like, no, I don't have a boyfriend, and here's why.
Right.
And instead of asking people about that, you know, one, maybe don't ask them at all, or two, if you're trying to get to, are you bringing a boyfriend to this work party, and be like, oh, are you bringing anyone with you? Like, are you bringing a friend, a partner? You don't have to assume that someone is dating the opposite gender. And I think that's really important for people to be aware of, because it happens all of the time. And especially for someone who, you know, maybe is trying to get through their coming out and they're not fully aware, or they're afraid to come out at work, that puts them in a really uncomfortable position. And so being intentional with the questions when you ask people about their personal lives, and just assuming who they're interested in and what kind of partner they may or may not have.
Yeah, and that language can be super intentional, can also signal to someone that it's a more open space for you, right? When people say words like, oh, are you, you know, did you want to bring someone to, you know, my barbecue on Saturday? Or do if you have a partner, like, please, you know, we'd love to have them join us for XYZ event. Like, that intentionality with language can make you feel like, oh, cool, this is a space for me. People recognize that, you know, relationships, you know, extend outside of sort of heterosexual spaces. I saw in the Q&A. Ben, thank you so much for asking. Yeah, if folks have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. But Natasha, it looks like we got one question Q&A. So I'm happy to, if we want to answer that live. Do you want me to read it out for folks?
Yeah, go ahead and read it.
Yeah, so can we talk about the othering that happens to, transgender and non-binary folks? And often sexuality and gender identity are conflated. And, we've talked a lot about, gay men and women so far. And so can we talk more about those experiences?
Yeah, there are certainly a great amount of nuances that happen for transgender and non-binary folk. When we think about the LGBTQ plus community as a whole, most of those have to do with sexual orientation, and being transgender is not related to someone's sexual orientation. It's about their gender and their gender identity. Recently, while doing a survey, I had one of the questions was asking, man, woman, non-binary, and a response I got was, well, why is there not a trans man and trans woman question? And it was like, because trans men are men and trans women are women.
Right.
Trans may be part of their identity that they want to be open. Maybe they don't want that to be present. And so it was, a moment for me to kind of let the person know the difference between the sexual orientation and the gender identity. And especially for non-binary folks, it's more and more, my partner, even, she identifies as non-binary and is using they and she pronouns and, finding herself. And when it comes to non-binary folk, asking what pronouns a person wants to use at the start, I keep mine on my LinkedIn, I keep it on my Zoom, on my email signature, just to say, I use she, her pronouns. If someone uses they, them, or maybe they just want to use their name, or they use they, she, or they use any other variation, it's an opportunity to have that conversation and for it to be a green light that I am a safe space to have that conversation with, or a brave space to have that conversation. But especially when it comes to trans Black women, we know that that's particularly a group that is targeted and murdered at an alarmingly high rate. So, I have a sticker, not that means that I'm doing the most work, but I have a Black Trans Lives Matter sticker on my bulletin board. And even this weekend with my fiance's family, they were talking about Black Trans Lives Matter seems like such a specific thing to talk about. It was like, well, that's because that specific subset of individuals are struggling the most out of all of us, because I believe the statistic last I saw was, the likelihood of being murdered was 1 in 12 or something like that. Definitely don't directly quote me on that, but it is something alarming when the fact that for me, that it's nothing close to that number. But yeah, when it comes to trans and non-binary folk, there are so many different issues that they face. And specifically with Lady, when we were creating Lady, it was not just about queer women, it was for queer women allies, it was for trans women, it was for non-binary, non-gender conforming folks, and really not pigeonholing to say, oh, if you don't look like this, you're not welcome. Oh, if you are, you're not one of my sisters, like CIS-ster, like cisgender, you're not welcome here. We wanted to be a space that really encouraged all aspects in all different pieces of the LGBTQ umbrella. Yeah, Julia, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think, when we think about sort of creating spaces within the community, I don't think we are as welcoming and embracing to sort of making spaces where queer men, queer women who are cis are in spaces with queer men and queer women who are trans, or trans men and women who don't identify as queer. One of my friends from my previous job, a trans woman, she identifies as lesbian, and when we were talking about going out, like nightlife in New York City, concerns about the bars that I'm talking about in New York City are open for lesbian women, or generally open for queer spaces, although full disclosure, like definitely not a lot of men at these places. That looks really different. But I think for her, that is a real concern. And what you talked about with Black trans women, that there's sort of not just an inclusion element, but a safety element, right? And thinking about, bringing more trans and non-binary folks into queer spaces, that those conversations around what kind of nightlife looks like and what social scenes look like, and definitely within workplace, as far as that representation is so low right now. But I think that as a community, we just really haven't bridged that gap yet. If I'm being honest, I know I have trans friends who I go out with in New York City, but it does not feel like spaces that we go to together are either super welcoming or really creating positive, like inclusive spaces for the TGNC community at large. I hope that is the next kind of evolution of where LGBT progress goes, particularly coming off of the pandemic. I think social spaces are really needed right now, and that human element and connection that we all crave and long for. But I don't think we are necessarily where we need to be. I do think, though, I just wanted to call out, your point, particularly about sort of Black trans women, I think largely reflects on intersectionality that's really important in these conversations, and that holding multiple identities should be celebrated as the beautiful things, but in most cases sort of can make you a target, right? And you're, more marginalized having those intersectional identities. The one thing I actually just want to maybe shout out is for folks who haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend Disclosure. It's the documentary on Netflix. Laverne Cox is the EP. I think for me, that film really opened up my eyes to how limited the portrayal of trans and non-binary experiences is in our media, and that particularly for the TGNC community, that the perceptions in media are negative, that those stereotypes are really negative in nature. And so it was beautiful to see more, the whole film is sort of produced and written and directed by TGNC and non-binary folks. But it was really incredible just to see that range of representation to start to reframe, how do we all think about what the trans experience is. I think it's something that for those of us within the community, unless we're really seeking out that education and learning about, the experiences of, like for myself as a white person, the experiences of, the Black LGBT experience in this country, the experience as a cis person of, trans and non-binary experiences, people think, straight cis people, I've often encountered, there's this perception like, oh, I must know everything about all LGBT experiences because I'm LGBT. And that's just not true. And I think for myself, I've tried to educate myself, increasingly over the years, but I don't think it happens without us making time for it. Like, our spaces don't proactively encourage us to be more educated because we're very divided in the spaces that we hold. So I just think that's important. And yeah, definitely, if folks haven't seen it, Disclosure, it's maybe just under 2 hours. It's an exceptional film, and highly recommend. Natasha, there is another question for you here. Can you expand more about your intersectional identities?
Yes, and I apologize, this is real life. There's a truck outside, so hopefully it's not too loud for all of you. But yes, definitely watch Disclosure. Actually, that's part of the work that at NWC Nika White Consulting, we do monthly different team building strategy sessions, and myself and my teammates Mark and Steph, we are working on a Pride specific session for the team, and part of the pre-work is to go and watch Disclosure. So it's on Netflix. If you don't have access to Netflix, ask a friend might have access and could loan it to you. But yes, in terms of my own intersectional identities, I am a woman, a cisgender woman. I am a Latina woman. I go by Latinx. Not necessarily. When it comes to my race and ethnicity, it's a mix of Latinx and Native American, undocumented. It's really on my dad's side, and we're not completely fully aware, again, undocumented there. And then a bunch of different white identities. My mom's family is like German and Finnish and apparently Irish, we discovered recently. And then I do identify as lesbian, queer. Something else that we did recently, we had our disability initiative, and I don't necessarily consider myself as someone with a disability at this point in time. I had severe anxiety and depression, but I take medication for it, which makes me more or less of the mental health I was beforehand, when I started having a decline in mental health.
Yeah.
So it is a mental health disability. It's a hidden disability, but again, it's a weird thing that I'm not necessarily ashamed of it, but it's like, I feel that I am the same person that I was before. So that's a little bit about my identities.
Yeah. And if you were to think about maybe, and I don't want to, build off of this person's question necessarily, but just thinking about, like intersectionality in the community, is there like, does anything come to mind as far as like how people either in a personal or professional way have been supportive in a way that feels like your intersectionality is being amplified and celebrated? Is there anything that you found to be particularly sort of helpful in that regard?
So could you ask the question one more time? Is it about like how other people have been allies to my different intersectional identities?
In thinking about sort of like you as a whole person, because I find that for me, I felt that allyship has felt really specific to parts of my identity and not me as just Julia, as just like a human trying to go through life as we are all trying to go through life the best we can. But I've felt, and I've tried to talk to friends about this. I think it's gotten better, but it's felt like sort of there's my gay identity and my female identity, and that those two intersections don't blend as far as how people kind of show up and show support, if you will. And part of that is sort of like society doesn't really teach us to be in like, think about intersectionality as a positive and thinking about like holding multiple identities as being beautiful, because usually the more identities you hold, the more at risk you are as a person, which is, and thinking about sort of marginalized communities, which is obviously really sad. But was just wondering, like, was there anything that, like I found for me in corporate spaces, gay men who pay attention to the space that men occupy has been really helpful, in that people sort of have viewed me as being more masculine and tangentially like able to speak up for myself. But as a woman, I find I'm frequently talked over in meetings, and having men who see those dynamics and are able to sort of pivot and say like, hey, John, that's a great thought. I think Julia was actually just wrapping something up. Would you mind? Like, I'd just love to hear, the end of that it doesn't have to be an abrasive thing, but like a small thing like that of someone saying like, hey, I see you, and I see this dynamic of you sort of being talked over. And I'm not just going to assume that like, and sometimes I am comfortable speaking up for myself, certainly, but there are times when it's very exhausting to constantly have to, advocate for yourself. And I've found that interaction, particularly like in LGBT spaces from men, has been like helpful in sort of making me feel like as a whole human, I'm sort of noticed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I've been very fortunate that, so one of my friends, Ryan, and I've mentioned this in a couple of other talks before, but when we think about like the melting pot of society and like how we kind of become this like conglomerate of all these things that turns into one, thinking of it instead of like a tossed salad, which you can see all the different pieces, but they're all harmoniously living together in one. And so there's all these different pieces of my identity that come together that, you can't look at it without seeing all of the things and like enjoying all of the things at one time. And so I've been very fortunate in the sense that I've been, for the most part, been able to be seen as all of those different parts of myself. It really isn't as much about my queer identity as more about my race. That's been sort of a weird point of contention for people throughout the years, of people being like, what are you? I think that you're this, my friends and I bet, and we think that you're this, or we think that you're that. And so that's been kind of strange.
Yeah.
Especially moving into the queer community. When I first got involved in it in Dallas, it was really white heavy. There was a lot of white women in their 40s plus, which they've paved the way and they've done great work. But I wanted to be able to see representation of different experiences, because it is different to be a white queer woman than it is to be a Black non-binary person or an Asian trans woman, and there are different experiences. And so I've been very fortunate that for the most part, my experience has been embraced as a whole. But when it hasn't, I've spoken up. And like you said, it's really exhausting to always be the one to speak up for yourself. And so that's where my allies that I built and I created and I formed in the workplace really came to help. Because, you know, there are, like I said, we don't want them to be the knights in shining armor, but when there are those opportunities that you're like, I am beaten, I am at my wit's end, they're like, I can be there, I can do that for you. And so it's certainly not what I want usually. You know, I want to be able to take care of myself, but when I'm like, you know what, I need you to come in and I need you to help out, they have been there for me to kind of be champions alongside me.
Yeah, when you're, you know, sort of very exhausted and you're like, you know, if someone could help out right now in this moment, it can really make a powerful difference. I just wanted to call it in the chat, Brian, thank you, the pronouns and definitions. And then I also, to the earlier question we received, Tomorrow Will Be Different, Love, Loss, and the Fight for Trans Equality. Stellar book, highly recommend folks check it out. It's written by Sarah McBride. She was the former National Press Secretary of the Human Rights Campaign. She's since gone on and is in the public office now. She's a Delaware State Senator, I believe, as of the 2020 election. So very cool, but definitely her book, it's definitely a love story between her and her husband, who unfortunately passed, but it's very helpful in sort of understanding and unpacking, you know, her lived experience, and particularly to the question, kind of talking about the othering, you know, that happens for trans folks in and outside of the LGBT community. So just before I close this out, you know, with some kind of next events coming up for Hummingbird, Natasha, any like final words you wanted to share with the panelists? Any birthday? Would you like? Should we sing? Or is that
no? I just
singing? Okay.
Say thank you again for having me, and happy early birthday to you, Julia. Geminis are the best.
We are. Yeah.
And again, thank you for having me. On the topic of trans folks, we have a conversation called Intentional Conversations, and next week we have Josephine, who is a white trans woman who works at Deloitte, and she and I will be having a conversation about her experience in the workplace. And so if you'd like to partake, it'd be wonderful to have you there as well. But feel free, anyone, to, whether you're watching live now or the recording, reach out. I'd love to connect and meet with you. And yeah, thank you everyone for your time.
Same, yes. And if anyone wants to chat more or has any questions, definitely feel free, you know, reach out to me on LinkedIn. And then just to close this out, so we are in Pride, which is super exciting. We have 2 more Pride events for Hummingbird coming up in June, one next week and one June 29th. And then we also have our first thought leadership paper, you know, Reframing Representation Matters is the theme. That will be released June 22nd, and there will be, you know, an event like this to kind of talk about that. So with that, I mean, I really feel like you're missing out on the singing, but I will spare everyone because I am no vocalist and it would be not pleasant. But, you know, thanks everyone for your time. And we, you know, really enjoyed having this conversation. Natasha, it was so great to chat with you. So thank you.
Absolutely. You too, Julia. Thank you, and happy Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride, everyone.